that tell me I'm no good, chapters that defined me for so long. But the hands of grace and endless love dusted off and picked me up, told my heart that hope is never gone. God is in this story, God is in the details, even in the broken parts. He holds my heart, He never fails. When I'm at my weakest, I will trust in Jesus. He is in the highs and lows, the one who goes before me. God is in this story.
So when the storm you're walking through feels like it's too much and you wonder if He even cares at all, well, hold on tight to what you know. He promised He won't let you go. Your song of healing's written in His scars.
God is in this story, God is in the details, even in the broken parts. He holds my heart, He never fails. When I'm at my weakest, I will trust in Jesus. Always in the highs and lows, the one who goes before me. God is in this story. If it reads like addiction, if it reads like disease, He's the one who frees the prisoner. He's the healer of all things. If it reads like depression, if it reads broken home, He's the one who holds our sorrow. He won't leave you here alone. God is in this story, God is in the details, even in the broken parts. He holds my heart, He never fails. When I'm at my weakest, I will trust in Jesus. Always in the highs and lows, the one who goes before me. Always in the highs and lows, the one who goes before me. God is in this story. God is in my story.
All right, thank you, ladies. Children's Church, you can be dismissed. There we go. I'm going to finish up this morning a one-sentence series we started 3 weeks ago. I put a challenge out to you before we get started and finish this up. As you read your Bibles, or if you've read your Bible and there's a conversation that has struck you as profound, or there's a sentence in the conversation in dialogue within the Bible that you have thought meant a lot to you, and maybe I haven't covered it in the last 3 weeks, text it to me this week. And I'd sure like to hear, because I know 66 books, about a book this thick. I had 16, 18 that I found. We'll have covered 16 of them, and I just want to hear if you guys have one sentence on a subject that you think kind of encapsulates all of something. And so that's what we've done. We started 3 weeks ago with one sentence about salvation, and we walked through the pages of the Bible where we see our salvation, our redemption, really summed up by biblical characters in one sentence. And so we saw Abraham on Mount Carmel with Isaac, where Isaac says to Abraham said to Isaac, "My God will provide Himself a lamb." And we talked about how God did provide Himself a lamb. We saw how Festus, when talking to Paul after Paul had preached the gospel to Festus, Festus sadly came to the conclusion. He said, "Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian." He was that close. We saw how that throughout the Bible, salvation is prevalent over and over and over again. Peter said to Jesus, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God," which is a declaration that's necessary for salvation. Then last week we saw one sentence about service, how our Christian lives, our Christian service can be summed up in a lot of cases in one sentence, and we talked about several of those. And this morning I've got one sentence about stuff, because it was some things that I thought were helpful but wouldn't fit into necessarily a particular category. So today we're kind of going to be a little bit scattered around, but some interesting conversations and interesting sentences that we'll cover today. Find the book of 2 Kings chapter 7. The book of 2 Kings chapter 7, that's where we'll start this morning. And again, just remind you, if you've got one in your mind, a sentence, a conversation that took place in the Bible that meant a lot to you, send it to me this week, and I'd sure like to read it and do some study on it as well. Also, as y'all are finding your place, Wednesday night, if you weren't here, we talked about whales, watermelons, worms, and wind, and we saw how God sends preparation into our lives. Sometimes it's to change directions, sometimes it's to bring joy, sometimes it's to bring sadness. But somebody that was in here asked the question, they were reading a Bible that did not say the word gourd like the one that I read, it just said plant. And so I wanted very quickly to show you why we use the one that we use and not another one. So a lot of them will say plant, and the question was asked to me, why does mine say plant? You read gourd, and someone had even told me they had gone and looked at the Greek word, and the Greek word is the word for plant. Well, the problem with that in particular is that if you're in the Old Testament, Greek is useless. It was written in Hebrew, and so if you're going to take it, you're going to go back to the original languages, don't go to Greek, because it wasn't written in Greek, it was written in Hebrew. So if you take that word in the book of Jonah and you take it to the original language, it is a word that is, I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I don't do Hebrew well, but it starts with a K, ends in Y-O-N, and in some of the modern translations interpret that word as plant. It's not completely inaccurate because that is a Hebrew word that they would use for plant, but it is not the same Hebrew word that if you were having a conversation with someone in Hebrew, they would use to just describe a plant. If you look back at the etymology of the word, where it came from, it is an alliteration of an Egyptian word, Khki, which is very similar to the Hebrew spelling, and that word they refer to a bottle gourd. And further giving proof to why the King James put the word gourd in there, if you go to the ruins of Nineveh right now, there is a bottle gourd that grows in the ruins, and it is prevalent. And so I just wanted to throw that out. We don't talk about it very often, but I had a conversation Wednesday night over dinner with somebody that asked that question. I just want to show you there's a reason why we believe this is the one, the Bible that you should hold in your lap. We had, when the King James was translated from the original tongues into English, it was not done by a committee that was looking to make money off of it. It was done by some of the greatest Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic scholars in the world at the time. And there's a reason why they didn't just say the word plant, because it's not the common word the Hebrews would use for plant. There was more to it than that. It had origination in a gourd. And so there it is. Just a little extra Bible study for you this morning. If you ever wondered why we use one, we get clarification. I can get in my mind a better picture of what Jonah was doing because I read the word gourd and know an idea of what the word gourd looks like. Somebody told me that they're translated it castor plant. And that's another, we don't have time to get into that, but there's a reason why that's not necessarily an accurate interpretation either. But I'm going to get into 2 Kings, and we'll do some Bible interpretation lessons another time. 2 Kings chapter number 7, if you look at verse number 1, I'll read down through verse number 4. Now, to get you some background here, Jerusalem is under a siege. They've been surrounded for a long time now. Things are not going well. An invading army is standing outside the gates. Nothing goes in, nothing comes out. No food can get in, no messages can get out. There's no help coming. They're stuck here. They believe, all of the inhabitants of Jerusalem believe they're going to starve to death. That's where we pick up. It's a really, really happy place to start a Sunday morning. But that's where we're at. So verse number 1 says, Then Elisha said, Elisha is the prophet, Hear the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, Tomorrow about this time shall a measure of fine flour be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel in the gate of Samaria. Then a Lord on whose hand the king leaned answered the man of God and said, Behold, if the Lord would make windows in heaven, might this thing be? And he said, Behold, thou shalt see it with thine eyes, but shalt not eat thereof. And I don't have time to go to this whole story, but that is an interesting thing that happens to this fellow. And then there were 4 leprous men at the entering in of the gate, and they said one to another, Why sit we here till we die? If we say we will enter into the city, then the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die also. Now therefore come, let us fall unto the host of the Syrians. If they save us alive, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall but die. It's an interesting phrase that we start with. So the walls, the cities are they're cut off, they're stuck there. The lepers were not allowed to have part with the regular folk in the Old Testament because it was such a contagious, devastating disease. And so there would be leper colonies, and they would have to stay away from the general population. In fact, kind of interesting, just not really helpful, but you've heard the term a stone's throw. He's a stone's throw away. In the Old Testament, a leper had to stay a stone's throw away from anyone that was clean. And in order to ensure that I stayed a stone's throw away from you, if I had leprosy, you could pick up a stone and throw it at me. And if you hit me, clearly I wasn't far enough away. And so they were outcasts of society, these 4 leprous men. And as they sit there, they're looking, if we go into the city, first of all, they're going to be upset with us because we're not supposed to be in the city, but then we're going to starve to death. And if we sit here at the gate, outside the walls, we're going to starve to death. So how about this? Why don't we just go see what the Syrians have to offer, and maybe they'll keep us alive, and if they kill us, then we're going to be dead in any way. And I love the phrase that they use here, and this is where we're going to take our first sentence this morning about stuff. He says, one of them says to the others, Why sit we here until we die? Their situation is ridiculous. In fact, if you'll notice their dilemma as they begin to talk here, there's no good outcome that they can see. They were living on the best day, a leper's life was horrible. It is a disgusting disease that would eat the flesh and the bones and the limbs, and it was common for noses to fall off and for fingers to drop off because of leprosy, and it was no cure known to anyone back then. It was a horrible disease. And so on a good day, had there not been a siege, had life been good for everybody in Jerusalem, these 4 lepers were going to live a miserable life. They couldn't work a job. They couldn't live in a home. They couldn't be around any of their loved ones. They had to reject everyone. They're just, their only company are other people that are missing fingers, toes, and noses, ears. And so on a good day, life is not great for a leper, but even worse on a bad day, because can you imagine what little food they would have gotten? All of the food that was available in the city would have gone to those who were able-bodied to help defend the city. It would have gone to the king and all of those who were in rule, but these lepers would have had nothing. And so their dilemma is this: they're going to starve. That's where they're at. They're going to starve. They were diseased. They were discarded by the regular population, and they were doomed. Diseased, discarded, and doomed. That's how you would have summed up these lepers. They had no hope. And so they come to themselves, and the phrase that one of them utters is, hey, why are we going to sit here till we die? In other words, we can sit here and expect the same thing to happen that's been happening for days and days and days. We're going to sit here with no food. We're going to sit here with no good contact with normal people. We're going to sit here and get a little bit hungry and a little bit weaker, and eventually we're going to die. Why sit we here till we die? Their dilemma was the fact that they were diseased and discarded, and they were doomed. But not just, I want you to notice their dilemma, but also notice their decision. They were not going to be contented with what they had been dealing with and what they had had up until this point since they became lepers. They weren't okay with just sitting until they die. Listen, friends, there are a lot of Christians that are just going to be content to sit until they die. They're going to be content to be, here's where I'm at. I'm just going to stay here, and eventually I'm going to die, and I'm going to go to heaven, and I'm good with that. And then they wonder, why does life not ever get better? Why does the spiritual walk never progress? Why does their service never get mature? Why are they not able to do more for the Lord than they did before? It's because they're just sitting there. They're just waiting. They're just not doing anything. And these lepers came to the conclusion that we can sit here, and we can accept our fate, or we can get up and make an attempt at doing something. Why sit we here till we die? They had their dilemma. Then there was the decision. It was, it's better to try something and fail than not to try anything and fail. Would you all agree with me? For them, in their position, it would have been better for them to do anything than just sit there and starve to death, or wait until enough of their limbs fell off that they would bleed out and they'd no longer live. There was something they needed to do. So their decision was to try to make themselves better, even if they did fail. And they knew that was a very real possibility. We can go into the city, and we'll starve there because everybody's starving there. We can sit here and we can starve to death. Or we can go into the camp of the Assyrians, and we can ask them for help, and maybe they'll give us some food, maybe they'll help us out, and maybe they'll kill us, but worst case scenario, we're going to be dead anyway because that's our three choices. And so their dilemma was that they would attempt to change their circumstances. They were tired of just sitting and thinking things would change on their own. And I've talked to some folks, and we're getting ready to do some. In fact, tonight we have a teachers meeting with our Sunday school teachers. Sunday school is not really well attended. It hasn't been since COVID started, and we can continue to do the things that we do. And by the way, if you don't come to Sunday school, if you're an adult, Brother Tim is a great Bible teacher. Does a great job. He's well studied every week, and I learn and appreciate it. So you're missing out. But even our kids' classes have shrunk since COVID and not built themselves back up. And so we want to look and see what we're doing that's not working and see if we can make an attempt and do something that might work a little bit better, but we're not going to sit here till we die. And that's what the lepers had decided to do. The rest of the children of Israel were inside the walls of Jerusalem, and they were going to sit there until they died. That was what they were doing. They realized they could never overcome that invading army. The Syrians were too strong for them. They realized that they were never going to be able to grow crops because every time they started coming out of the ground, somebody would snatch them up and eat them. They were going to sit there, and they were going to starve to death. And so of all of the people in the city of Jerusalem, there were 4 of them that had decided, we're not going to sit here until we die. We're going to get up and we're going to do something. We're going to make an effort to do better than we're doing. And that's what they decided. We see their dilemma and then their decision. Let me say thirdly, we see their delight. Look down, I haven't read it yet, but let's read. In verse 5, and they rose up in the twilight to go. By the way, that's dangerous, isn't it, to go to the army camp in the middle of the night? That just doesn't make sense to me, but that's what they did. They rose up in the twilight to go unto the camp of the Syrians. And when they were come to the uttermost part of the camp of Syria, behold, there was no man there. For the Lord had made the host of the Syrians to hear a noise of chariots and a noise of horses, even the noise of a great host. And they said one to another, Lo, the king of Israel hath hired against us kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to come upon us. Wherefore they arose and fled in the twilight and left their tents and their horses and their asses and even the camp as it was, and they fled for their lives. And when these lepers came to the uttermost part of the camp, they went into one tent and did eat and drink and carried thence silver and gold and raiment and went and hid it, and came again and entered into another tent and carried it thence also and went and hid it. Look at their delight. So can you imagine how terrifying this must have been? They are leprous. They're coming into an invading army's camp, and they're expecting maybe to be taken, at best case, taken prisoner, given some food. Worst case scenario, to be killed on the spot. And yet they get here and they realize there's no sentries post at the edge of the camp. And it's really quiet. Even though it's nighttime, it's really quiet. And they get in there and there's no one there. Can I give you a little bit of an analogy? This tells you that all of the people in Jerusalem were being held hostage by an imaginary enemy. They were being held back at this point by something that did not even exist. And I wonder how many times in our Christian life are we to the same mindset? We're just going to sit here till we die because we're afraid of whatever that thing that we've put in our lives. God says to do this, and we think, well, I don't have the talent to teach a class, or I don't have the talent to sing in front of the church, or I don't have the talent to do this. And it's something that God says you can overcome, but you've decided that that phantom enemy is going to keep you sitting there until you die. These lepers came into the camp, and they saw there was nobody, so you see what they did. They went to the first tent. They ate as much as they could possibly eat. They took the silver and anything that was of value, they took it out, they hid it where nobody would find it. They thought, well, I can eat some more now because I've been starving for months. They go back into another tent, they clean that tent out. Everything is great. We see their dilemma, we see their decision, then their delight. But let me show you one thing that separates these lepers from, I think, what a lot of people would have done. Would you also notice the delivery of their message? Look what it says in verse number 9. Then said they one to another, We do not well. This day is a day of good tidings, and we hold our peace. If we tarry till morning light, some mischief will come upon us. Now therefore, come, that we may go and tell the king's household. And they came and called unto the porter of the city, and they told them, saying, We came to the camp of the Syrians, and behold, there was no man there, neither voice of man, but horses tied and asses tied, and the tents as they were. I read this story and I read this conclusion. We saw them go from a dilemma to a decision that they made to the delight that they found, and now there's a delivery that they're going to make with a message. And I realized that these four men were cast out of the city. They were rejected. They were looked on as filth and useless by everyone inside that city. And yet when they found salvation, they were willing to take that message back to the same people that hated them, that didn't want nothing to do with them, that had no good for them in mind. They were willing to take it. And here you and I sit, 2022. We have the solution for the curse of sin that everyone around us has. And yet we remain silent about it so often. We've maybe in a spiritual sense, we've done what those lepers did. We weren't going to sit here till we die. We're going to come and accept the good message of salvation. But once we've gotten it, we're not going to do what they did and go tell the people. We're going to sit here and just sit on it. We're going to enjoy our Christian life. We're going to eat all we can eat. We're going to hide all we can hide, but we're not going to tell anybody about it. And if anyone had an excuse to not deliver a message of salvation to the city of Jerusalem, it would have been these four men who had been treated so poorly by the general population up until this moment. And I look at their decision and then their dilemma, and we see their delight. But what's impressive to me is they started out with, why sit we here till we die? And they end with being the prophets of good news to the rest of the city. And so I'm going to hurry along because I don't want to stay here all morning. But this one sentence that changed 4 lives. Listen, not only 4 lives, but it changed the outcome of this fight. One sentence. Why sit we here till we die? Christian, I trust that you're not just sitting today until you die. I trust that with God's help, you're going to get up and move forward and do what He's called you to do and search and try to better yourself and try to get involved in the ministry and do the things that God's called you to do. Don't just sit there till we die. Let me give you the second thing. We talk about one sentence about stuff. Look in Genesis chapter 50, if you would. Genesis chapter 50. So one, why sit here till we die? The second one that we see is in Genesis chapter 50. And look at verse number 20. Back up, let's look at verse number 18. And his brethren also went and fell down before his face, and they said, Behold, we be thy servants. And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. One sentence about stuff. Joseph says to his brothers, you meant it evil unto me, but God meant it for good. And we in our Christian lives, we so often go through circumstances that are difficult and they are a challenge to us. And we think, well, this was meant to be evil. And yet if we believe the Bible, we read Romans 8 and verse number 28, where the Bible says, For we know that all things work together for the good to them that love God, to them that are the called according to His purpose. And here's Joseph having been through, I don't want to have to go through the whole story of Joseph. Y'all know the story. He was taken and sold into slavery, and he somehow ended up in Egypt, and he ended up in Potiphar's house, and then in jail again, and then he got elevated to number 2 in the kingdom, and now here he is with the authority and the power to kill the brothers that were going to try to kill him, but they didn't. And so we look at this story, we see, number 1, his brothers' actions. They conspired to kill him early on in his life. He was just a young man, and they tried to kill him. They didn't only did they try to kill him, but they sold him to the highest bidder. That was only done because one of the brothers talked the rest of them out of killing him outright. He said, let's not kill him, but let's sell him into a slavery. And so they did. And then they'd spent the next decades trying to forget about him. That was his brother's actions. That's what they did. That's what when Joseph says to his brothers, you meant it for evil, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the year, first of all, the day in the pit, or the days in that pit where they threw him down there in that nasty, miry clay where he was stuck. And then when he says, you meant it evil, he's talking about when they pulled him out, and maybe he thought things were going to get better, and they just sold him as a slave into slavery. He was talking about that, you meant it for evil. And then as he finds himself in Egypt in Potiphar's house, and the Lord blesses him, and he begins to get some good happening in his life, all of a sudden, Potiphar's wife accuses him of immorality, and he's cast into prison. And when he says, you thought it and meant it evil, he's talking about the minutes and the days and the years he spent in prison. And yet here he is, understanding that after it's all said and done, and he's able to look back on his circumstances. He said, I didn't see it back then when I was in the pit, but I can stand here today. Today, I can see that where you meant evil for me, God was using that to be good for me, but also for our whole family and eventually the nation. And so we see his brother's actions. Not only do we see his brother's actions, but we also see his brother's attitudes here. They were attitudes of hate and of jealousy and of anger. I cannot imagine getting to the place where this is the emotions that you feel towards a sibling. I can't imagine it. Now, I grew up with a brother and sister, and there were moments where in that instant I wanted to kill him, my sister more than my brother, but both of them occasionally. And sometimes my brother and I, that would cause us to be in a fist fight, which we did with regularity, even till I was driving in 16, too old to be fighting, but we occasionally. And so there were times when there was some animosity there, and I was aggravated with him. But I cannot imagine getting to the place where either my sister or my brother, I would look at them and hate them, and I feel so jealous of them, and have such a disdain for them that I would think about killing them, and in a gesture of being nice, instead of killing them, just send them to live as a slave in Egypt. I can't imagine getting there, but that's what his brothers were. Their attitudes were horrible. And when Joseph is saying you thought it evil, you meant evil, he's talking about their actions and then their attitudes. And so let me hurry along this morning because we got several more to cover. Let me notice Joseph's acknowledgement. Do you know what he's saying as we read verse number 20? But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. Do you know what he was really saying to them? If we can paraphrase, he was saying, number one, God is in control. And Christian, I want to remind you today that no matter what life looks like for you, you may find yourself today in the pit, not of your own doing. Somebody's put you there. You're dealing with difficulty because of the actions of other people. But can I remind you that God is still in control? That's what Joseph is acknowledging here. He said, look, you guys took some actions, but at the end of the day, God is the one that allowed it, and he is in control, and he's the one that is working and doing above all these things. God is in control. And then the lesson that is difficult for us often, not only does Joseph acknowledge that God is in control, but Joseph had to acknowledge that his brothers were not his enemy. Those men in Joseph's life that had treated him so poorly, that had beaten him and thrown him in a pit and sold him into slavery and told his daddy was dead, those brothers, those men in his life, listen, Joseph acknowledged they were not the ones that were the enemy. And here's the lesson for you and I, because in our lives we're going to be mistreated by people. And if you're in church, sometimes you're going to be mistreated by church people. And the wrong attitude to take would have been the opposite of what Joseph did, where he had the authority to have them thrown into prison. But he didn't. And it wasn't that Joseph didn't necessarily want revenge, but it was because Joseph realized that they're not the enemy. And above all of this, all the things that God allowed to happen to him over the last decades in Egypt, he realized that even though they did things that were adverse to his well-being, God is in control, and he is not their enemy, and they are not his enemy. The way that he handled this is astounding to me. It's astounding to me. We see his acknowledgement that God is in control, that his brothers are not his enemy. And then, somehow, he's able to love his brothers even though they treated him the way that they did. And I don't have time to open this thought up, but we're brothers and sisters. And not just this assembly, but the churches down the road that preach and teach the Bible like we do. Brothers and sisters. You know, it's important in 2022 that the world looks at us and sees us behaving the way Joseph did, even when we disagree with our brothers and sisters. Even when we have a difference of opinion, even when they may have done something that we don't like, or maybe even feel like we've been offended and personally affronted by whatever it is they've done, Joseph says, I'm still going to love you anyway. Jesus, talking to his disciples, said that by this shall all men know that you're my disciples, by the love that you have one for another. Joseph's one sentence was, you thought it evil against me, but God meant it for good. Let me give you another one this morning as we hurry along. Would you look at Job chapter 13? Job chapter 13, just before the book of Psalms. Job has already, at this point in the book of Job has already lost everything. You'll know what he suffered at the very beginning, the first couple of chapters. He's got nothing left Doesn't even have his health left. His poor wife has watched him be reduced from this greatest man in the East down to this heap in a ash pile, just trying to get relief from the sores that he's got. She can't take it anymore. She thinks he should just die so that his suffering can be over. His friends Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, by the time we get to chapter 13, they've all come to him because they heard of the suffering that he was going through, and they sat with him for a week and didn't say a word. Just sat with him, which was great. There are some times when you just need a friend. You don't need advice. You don't need wisdom out of their mouth. You don't need them to tell you what you need to do. You just need them to be there. And that's what Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar did. The problem is, on the 8th day, they started talking. And I don't have time to sum up all three of their messages, but there was a fourth friend that came, a Tenamite. He was a young fellow, shouldn't have been talking at all, but he did. But all four of them, their messages, in essence, were this: God wouldn't punish someone that was innocent, therefore you must be guilty. You need to repent of your sin, and maybe God will get things right back where you were. That was the best advice Job's friends could offer him, seeing him, watching him go through the loss of his finances and the loss of his family and the loss of his fitness. It's all gone, and the best advice they could have was, you're guilty before God, get it right. So Job chapter 13, Job has listened to one of their self-righteous, pious speeches, and he's decided that he's going to answer the proclamation that they made. Job chapter 13, look at verse number 15. We'll just look at this one phrase. He says in verse 15, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Talk about a profound response to misery. This misery that Job had gone through, his friends were sure that God had sent it to him. And as far as Job knows, in Job chapter 13, he thinks God has submitted him to all of this suffering. He thinks in his mind that God had taken everything he had that was of any value away. He believes in his heart that God had killed all of his children when that house collapsed on them for no apparent reason. He believes in Job 13. He believes that God had given him those sores from the crown of his head to the sole of his feet. He believes at this point that God has done all of that to him. See, you and I get the benefit of reading Job from hindsight. We know how it ends in Job 42. We understand that. Job in Job chapter 13 doesn't know that there's a better day coming. He just knows right now he is miserable. And his heart believes, not only is he miserable, but he believes that the God that he has served to the best of his ability has brought all of this upon his head. That's what he believes. So with that in mind, and understanding where Joseph's head is at this point, to read what he says there, where he says, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him, it is an unbelievable statement to be able to make. This is not Job looking and going, look, God's allowed the devil to do this so that he can get the glory. Job doesn't know any of that. This is not Job looking and going, well, when a few chapters later on, I'm going to get all of my stuff back and I'm going to have more children than I had before. I'm going to be wealthier and my health is coming. That's not this Job. This Job believes that God has brought all of that on his head. And yet in the middle of that, he says, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. He says in the next verse that he's basically going to continue to live the life that he believes he was called to live. If you look at verse number 16, verse 15 and 16. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him, but I'll maintain mine own ways before him. In other words, Job is saying, I don't care, friends, what you've said, what you think, what you believe, you're mistaken. The way that I'm living now is the way that I have always lived, and to the best of my ability, I've been right with him. And so though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. We know Job's situation here. There's no need to go over it. He has lost everything he had. He is poor, he's childless, and he is sick. A lot of us could deal with one of those three things, maybe, and handle it the way that Job did. But I wonder if there's a single person in this room this morning that would go through what he went through, losing all of his wealth, losing all of his children, then coming to the place where he's got these sores that are not getting any better, they're continuing to get worse, and still be able to say, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. We know Job's situation. It's miserable. Not only do we know Job's situation, but we also can see Job's sadness. Flip back a couple of chapters to chapter 10. Not just his situation, but also we see the sadness that Job was dealing with. Look what he says in verse 10. My soul is weary of my life. He says, I'm tired of living. I can't take this anymore. These circumstances are beyond what I can deal with. My soul is weary with my life. I will leave my complaint upon myself. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say unto God, do not condemn me. Show me wherefore thou contendest with me. You see what I'm saying? Where he believes that God has brought all this on him. It is good unto thee that thou shouldest oppress, that thou shouldest despise the work of thine hands, and shine upon the counsel of the wicked. Hast thou eyes of flesh, or seest thou as a man seeth? Are thy days as the days of man? Are thy years as a man's days? That thou inquirest after mine iniquity, and searchest after my sin? Thou knowest I am not wicked. And if there were none that can deliver out of thine hand, and there is none that can deliver out of thine hand, thy hands have made me and made and fashioned me together round about, yet thou dost destroy me. Job is ignoring his friends at this point, and he's talking directly to God. Knowing that he's lived his life as best he could live it, as a holy person. And yet he says, you've created me. My soul's tired of living. And yet you're destroying me with your own hands, is what he says in essence. We see Job's sadness and Job's situation, but then in that statement that Job makes, we see Job's statement in chapter 13, when he says, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Job is really saying a couple of things. He's saying, first of all, he knows he's living right, because he goes on in the same verse to say that I'm going to live in my ways. I'm going to continue to do what I've been doing, because he knows he is living right. Job's statement also says that he knows that God knows what he's going through. It's a statement of acknowledgement that God sees Job and that he knows where he's going through, what he's going through. Job also, in that verse number 15, also is stating that he will not turn back and away from serving God. He's not going to abandon God just because times are difficult. And then lastly, most profoundly, he's going to trust God even if it means his own death. We see just one little sentence in the book of Job, and yet it's profound. Job says later on in this book, after his friends are done, he says, I look to my right hand and I can't see the work of God in my life. I look to my left hand and he's not there. I go down into the pit and I don't see him working there. I look ahead of me into my future and I don't see him working there. But then he says this, but he, that is God, knoweth the way that I take. And when he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold. We often talk about Job as a man of patience, but this is spiritually a profound place that Job finds himself in. That he's able to say, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. So I'm going to hurry along. I've gone over it anyway, but I'm going to give you the last one very quickly. No, I'm not. We'll save it. I'm not going to try to rush through it. We got one more sentence about stuff maybe we'll get to next Sunday morning if the Lord will let us. Maybe you got some that you'll send me. We'll have another message in this series. So as the piano player's coming, we're bowing our heads. Just a couple of questions. We kind of been in a miscellaneous topics this morning. I wonder, with no one looking up, with every head is bowed and every eye is closed, I wonder if there's somebody here this morning that you're like the leper sitting outside the gate, but you've not made the decision. You haven't said to yourself, why am I going to sit here till I die? Maybe God's calling you to move, to do something more than you've done in the past. Maybe he's calling you to take your ministry and whatever it is that you've been given to do and do more. Why don't you make the decision these lepers made? And we're not going to sit here. We're going to do what we're going to move. We're going to take some action rather than just sit here. Maybe you need to not sit here till you die anymore. Maybe you're here this morning and you're struggling with circumstances that are beyond your control. Maybe there are circumstances that someone else has brought into your life, like Joseph's brothers did. This morning, can you say like Joseph did, though someone meant it for evil, I know that at the end of the day, God meant it for good, and maybe your attitude can change toward your circumstances. And then maybe this morning you find yourself in a miserable place like Job, whether it's your health or your finances or family issues, with God's help, you can say the same thing that Job said in the middle of his difficulty. Lord, I trust you to the point that though you slay me, yet will I trust in you. Romans 8:28 is still there. All things work together for good. We can trust him because he loves us. And though we may not see it and understand it like Job did, we can trust the fact that he knows what is best. God in heaven, I pray now that as we sing that you'll seal the message to our hearts. Help us to be like the lepers, willing to get up and move and make some progress and try to do more. Lord, help us to be like Joseph and acknowledge the fact that sometimes people around us give us difficult situations and circumstances, and they may even mean it to our harm, but we know that you're in control and you mean it for our good. Some of us may be like Job, just things around us are difficult. We're going through dark moments in our lives. Would you help us to, like Joseph, with our hearts say, though you slay us, yet we trust in you. Have you will you weigh in the invitation now. In Jesus' name we pray.